Welcome to Glasscast, a podcast of the National Glass Association and Glass Magazine. Once again, I am your host, Katy Devlin. In today's podcast, we are talking about trends and mergers and acquisitions in the manufacturing segment with Scott Mashuda, the founder and CEO of REAG. Scott has more than 2 decades of experience in M&A. He is a Pittsburgh native who lives in Cleveland right now. He is a dad of five, a hockey coach, and a hockey dad. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
So I have to start out with the hockey. First of all, who's your team? Who are you cheering for?
Yeah, it was probably pretty obvious. It's Pittsburgh Penguins. That's where I grew up. That's where my allegiances are sports wise, which makes it tough to live in Cleveland, as you can imagine. Football's big in both towns, and my kids play hockey here, which is not super popular in Cleveland. So we spend a lot of time back in Pittsburgh playing hockey and stuff like that. I don't coach actually. I just a dad. I played football in college, and I do not do well on skates. So I'm just a dad. That's all.
Well, I am a proud aunt of four very active hockey players, and I think once you are a hockey parent, you are in part a coach. It is just it's the spirit of the sport, right?
That's right. It sucks you in. It's you have to be very committed as a parent to be willing to do the things that hockey parents
Yeah.
have to do. That's for sure.
Yeah. So, Scott, I start out all of these podcasts by just asking our guests to introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about their professional experience, and then, you are a new entrant into the glass industry in some ways, though certainly not new to M&A. So, it will be good to introduce yourself to this audience.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. And I don't know that I can do much better than the intro that you provided. That was fantastic. But yeah, so Todd Torquato and I started this firm in 2004. So we've been doing this a long time. We do lower middle market mergers and acquisitions. So we help business owners, founders, maybe Gen 1, Gen 2, really retire. I mean, you don't tend to think about it that way, but when you have a regular job, a W-2 or a 1099, and you decide you want to retire, you can make that decision, give a couple of weeks notice, and there you go. But if you own the company, you built this thing, or you bought it and you're running it, getting a path to an exit to where you can retire and spend the time that you want to spend the way you want to spend it. The burden of being the boss, the business owner, having those decisions weigh on you, constantly reinvesting your capital back in the business. You have to have a path to call it quits, if you will. And so really we've spent the last 20 years of my life learning, really, right? You start a business, and just like everybody out there that's done the same, you think you know what you're doing, you think you know what you're talking about, and you learn something new every day, you learn something every year. And I like to think, here we are, 22 years later, and I think I actually know what I'm doing at this point. At least that's what I'm claiming. So yeah, we do call it $2 million in EBITDA, up to $25 million in EBITDA. If you translate that to revenue, maybe 10 to 15 million in revenue, up to 20 or 250 million in revenue, roughly. So large spectrum of companies, but the real key is that we deal with founder owned, lower middle market companies. That's our niche.
Yeah, and the glass industry is really full of a lot of family businesses, multi-generational family businesses, or businesses that have gone from owner and founder to management buyout or other forms. So it's definitely, I'm sure what you have to say resonates with a lot of our listeners. So we are recording this episode in advance of NGA's brand new event for the Glass Fabricators called GFAB. Will be coming to Chicago June 14th through 17th. And GFAB is really designed for decision makers at glass fabrication facilities, decision makers in every part of that company. So folks who are running the business, the owners, founders, the CEOs, that level, as well as your technical engineering leads, and your production floor leaders. So in our prior episodes in this GFAB preview on Glasscast, we've been focusing on technological advancements for the factory floor. that topic will certainly be central to GFAB, but right alongside that, we'll be presenting sessions dedicated to market trends and insights to help our fabrication leaders understand the forces affecting the industry and make the best decisions for their companies and for themselves. And you'll be part of that. You're one of our keynotes during the first day of programming at GFAB, which we're calling our executive track. And one thing that we asked you to come and chat with this audience about is just the state of M&A right now in our world. So can you talk a little bit about the state of the industry in terms of these ownership transitions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you what was going to happen or what I think is going to happen. But, in my mind, really what we're seeing is a convergence of a number of different factors. You have the M&A markets, and then you have, the glass markets, and you have the construction markets, right? And all these things are kind of turning on their own and independently, but they all matter when you think about an exit, right? And so on the M&A side, there's so much dry powder out there right now that needs to be put to work. And, when I say so much, I think the last estimate I saw was like $2 trillion in dry powder. It's a massive amount of money. And the deployment of that has been pretty slow over the last, 12 to 18 months, we'll call it. Everybody, buyers and sellers kind of went into 25, I would think, on pretty level footing. At least that's how I felt personally, and thought it was going to be a great year for M&A, but then tariffs happened. So you take January, February through May of just all this market disruption where, one thing buyers don't like is risk. And, when you think about buying and selling anything, it's really a risk versus return analysis. And these companies are no different. And so when you introduce risk into the market, it changes everything. So, I mean, we saw it. How many times I think have you seen it? You've seen it 08, 09. You saw, huge risk put in the market there. COVID, huge risk was put in the market. Tariffs last year. And so not a whole lot of deals happened where volume was way down like the first half of last year. Kind of picked up in Q3 and Q4, but was driven largely, I would say, by larger deals. So the volume of deals was down. So when you see the numbers, it feels like it's a big market, but it really wasn't that big of a market in my opinion. So you still have that dry powder sitting there. You have 12 to 18 months where maybe the volume wasn't there. I think in the glass industry, for example, supply chains are pretty solid. Folks figured that out during COVID. A lot of glasses, produced domestically. People were buying domestically, in my experience. And then you have the non-commercial or the commercial real estate markets, non-residential. You have, all the data sites, the data centers that are going in, and these forces that are kind of coming. And you feel this uptick happening industry wise, and then the M&A dry powder sitting there. I mean, deals are going to happen. It's a matter of when things really start to kick off and take off again. They're just all very cyclical industries, and you don't want to sell at the end of a cycle. You want to sell towards the beginning of a cycle. If you think about it from a buyer's perspective, yes, you have to have good numbers down on paper. You have to have a good track record and a solid history, which they can make decisions on and fairly assess risk. But if you try to make all the money that's out there to be made, and then the cycle's on its way down and you're selling on the way down, listen, your buyer's probably in the industry also. They know this. They know it's on the downside of a cycle. They're not really going to deploy a whole bunch of capital at that point in time to ride out the next, downturn essentially. So, when things are picking up, when you have a year or two that under your belt, it's time to go. So you need to be eyes wide open. The M&A market is very strong. The money's out there. Anybody that sits in my seat can kind of advise you on what's going on there. But I think, as a business owner, you feel what your business is doing. You understand your end markets. You understand your industry. And I think we all kind of feel the same thing coming. So you have to plan for that. It's not an event. It's a process. And I think people fail to realize that. And that's one of the things that I talk about a lot is, an exit is a process.
So in that answer, you were talking a lot about big big market forces
Mhm.
that can kind of come into this decision, and also just the numbers that an owner and might be looking at when they kind of are coming into this process. But there's also the people component, which I find very compelling, particularly for these family businesses. As I mentioned, there are a lot of family-owned glass businesses right now, and they find themselves at a crossroads. Maybe the founder is ready to step back, and the next generation is either stepping up or maybe stepping away and moving on to something else. How common is that type of scenario in the work that you do, and what makes it so complicated to navigate with those relationships?
Yeah. How common is it? I feel like I've dealt with that every day for the last 22 years. So that's how common it is. Um, it's it's very challenging, and it's all because of emotion. And you can't strip the emotion and the human element out of these things. Outside of the relationships that business owners and executives have with the people that work with them. There's relationships with the community. There's relationships with a lot of people, and part of it is just a mortality
Mm.
side of it. You're looking at you've spent all your time, or your whole focus has been building this business, growing this business, achieving certain goals. And business owners are driven people, and it's all been about the scorecard and the objectives that they wanted to accomplish. And now you're kind of throwing that a curveball there and saying, well, now it's time to step back and think differently. What does it look like underneath somebody else's ownership? What can they do with this? Where's the opportunities for them? Have you built this thing in a way where you can step out of it and somebody else can step in and this thing goes? Who has the relationships with the customers and the vendors? And have you built a management team that can run this company without you? All these things that maybe weren't at the forefront of your mindset as you built it now become real. And when you start to maybe see some of the flaws in the business that other people are telling you about, when a buyer comes in, for example, and looks at that, or someone like me comes in before the buyer and we say, hey, well, have you thought about this? Maybe we should do this before you go to market. Maybe you should do that, because it's basically like going to the doctor and getting an exam, the poking and the prodding. It's really frustrating. It's really emotional. And you start to build this wall of, well, forget these guys. Like, I don't need to take this from them. Who are they to tell me my baby's ugly? And it's like, well, don't take it personal, right? It's that risk versus return analysis that we talked about before. They're trying to assess risk. These are the risk factors with the business. And as I said before, if you think about it more of a process, you can take some of that risk out earlier by changing a few things and then get a higher return later
Mhm.
because you made those adjustments. And that's really what this is all about.
So one thing that came up in the prep conversations for this interview is the unsolicited offer call, right? It's how frequently owners might be receiving those calls, whether they're from competitors, from PE. Um, for an owner who gets that call out of the blue, what's the biggest mistake that you see them make, and what could they or should they be doing instead?
Yeah, if I were to guess, I think when you said the word unsolicited offer, your entire audience just groaned because they get so many of them. They get pummeled with this stuff. If you think about that $2 trillion of capital that needs put to work, the business owners are the ones that are bearing the brunt of that outreach and folks trying to find places to put that to work. So I think, excuse me, I think everybody's getting them. It's certainly happening. What you do with them, though, I think a lot of people fail there, candidly. It's easy to have an emotional reaction to that. Who do you think you are? I'm not selling it, and have an adverse reaction. And it's really that's the wrong thing to do. What you should do is either one of two things: either put it in the drawer and just make a stack of them and keep piling them up, because at the end of the day, you're probably building your own buyer list from the folks that are reaching out to you because they know something about your business, are interested in your business. And when you're me, and the objective that you're trying to accomplish is to maximize, value, and price being one of the components of value, and I have to go build this market. Well, the way you extract maximum value is you create competition. So if you tell me who's willing to compete for ownership of this company, that makes our list that much better and allows us to extract that much more value. So the last thing you want to do is react emotionally and throw it away. The last thing you want to do is return that phone call or return that outreach and have this discussion alone. I can to give you a perfect example. We just closed a deal the end of last year. The business owner came to us through their financial advisor who had a relationship with us. And they had told their financial advisor that they were thinking about exiting. And the buyer was a friend of theirs who sold his company to private equity. And now the private equity group wanted to do some add-on acquisitions and grow the platform that they acquired. And because of the relationship that they had with the prior seller, they felt very comfortable about everything he was telling them, and their plan was to sell to that particular buyer. And the financial advisor said, "Hey, wait a minute, before you do anything, you should really talk to the guys over at REAG, at least have a conversation with them, get their thoughts." And so we knew kind of roughly what was being talked about in that conversation. We shared our thoughts and we said, "Hey, listen, we think we can extract some additional value for you here if you create a competitive process, because no one's gonna pay a premium unless they have to, right? You don't come in with your highest and best rate off the bat." So what we did, and it's a tough decision because we cost money. We're not free. Our service isn't free, and everybody knows that. And it says, okay, well, if I have to pay you and I have to sell, then I have to get that plus your fee plus something additional to make this make sense. And we're very candid with our clients. We said, listen, understand that, and I think this is the right route for you to go. Fast forward, the numbers weren't even close at the end of the day. We brought a couple other buyers to the table. The numbers were all very similar at that initial LOI stage. But then we really, went back to everybody and said, hey, if you want to win this deal, this is what's important to the client. This is what it's going to take. And the buyer stepped forward. And it became very, very clear. And it ended up being the buyer that they spoke to initially, that they wanted to sell to all along. But the deal was structured and done in a way which the seller was very happy with. Some of the things that they were able to get assurances on, they would not have had they not run a formal process. And one of those things, yes, is dollars and cents, but one of the biggest things that sticks out in my mind is how the employees were handled and treated going forward, and the assurances that the seller got in that regard. And again, everybody thinks that when you're talking about getting the best outcome for the client and maximizing value, that you're talking about money. And value's in the eyes of the beholder, and it's not always money that's the driving force of these transactions.
Yeah, tell me about that. What does a good outcome actually look like?
Great question. And it's going to be different for every business owner. And that's the key, is defining what a good outcome looks like for you. Because if you sketch that out, you'll hear these stories and these statistics about business owners being unsatisfied after they sell and the regret that they have. And usually in that scenario, it's because they didn't define what success looked like. So I mentioned at the beginning, I played college football. Think about running around the field without knowing where the goal line is. What are you doing? You just look silly. But you have to say, well, here's the goal line. Here's what the goal line looks like for me. And if I can accomplish these things and get here, I'll be happy with that, right? And so then when you're REAG, you say, okay, well, how do I create that outcome for you? Who do we need to be talking to? What changes do we have to make to the business? How do we get to this end goal line that you're shooting for? So the honest answer is every business owner is going to have a different answer to that question. And it's our job to kind of help get you there and help unlock that. And if you're being unreasonable, it's my job to tell you that as well, right? And it's just the seat that we sit in.
So, a theme that I'm hearing throughout this conversation is that all of this planning, it takes a lot of time. The owners really need to consider what they want for themselves, the legacy for the company, their succession plans. And I think there's a tendency to wait on sort of having some of these conversations and going through these thought processes. But in our prep, you mentioned that there is a hidden risk of waiting. And I wonder if you can talk through the real risk of waiting, the cost of that, and what options tend to close off the longer someone delays.
Yeah, I think the real risk is not getting the outcome that you want or in the time frame that you want. And you talked about timing a little bit. If for us to accomplish what you're hiring us to do, which is facilitate an exit, it typically takes, I tell folks to plan for 12 months. I mean, it is not an event, it is a process. So you might say, okay, I want to sell, I want to exit, go ahead and create a market, put a deal together, and help me get through due diligence and get to a closing. That's a 12-month process. Now, a buyer on a transaction that says, oh, we want you to stick around for another 12 months. We want you to stick around for 24 months post close. Okay, now we're talking about 3 years, right? And the day that you came to me initially, we're assuming the business is ready to go to market. You've done the things that you need to do to have a marketable company that buyers want to invest in or transact with. So if you didn't, that's where I say rewind that even further. 2, 3 years before that, where you say, hey, can you guys take a look at this thing for me? Tell me where I'm missing. What changes if I want to maximize my value? What do I need to do differently that I'm not doing right now? Well, we can't give you that advice if you come in and say, hey, I'm ready to go. Get me out of this thing. It's like, okay, well, it is what it is. I'm not a miracle worker. Miracle work is a different profession from investment banking, right? So, this is what we think we could get for you. This is probably who it's attractive for. Oh, by the way, you still have 12 months 9 to 12 months while we run that process, and then whatever time frame you have to stick around for. So the timing element is crucial. You really can't get started too soon. And if you want to do a transaction where maybe you don't sell 100% of the equity right off the bat, you stick around, you help grow it to a certain point. You want to be a platform for a private equity group. Well, they're going to want you to be the engine of that growth, the engine of that platform. Think about the story I told you a little while ago about that business owner who sold his company. And then the private equity group wanted to do add-ons for that and sell, acquire additional companies to bolt on there. That business owner has to stick around, through that process and help the group identify who would be a good bolt on here, who's a cultural fit for this, what would make sense for us to acquire, and then really help drive that engine forward. So that's a scenario where you kind of paint yourself into a corner of being an add-on for somebody else versus being a platform. If you're at the end of the timeline when you get started, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So let's break this down. You've got someone maybe listening, an owner who's like, yeah, this is something maybe not in the next year or two, but something on the horizon that I need to be thinking about. What's one thing that you would tell an owner to do in the next 30 days so they can set themselves up for success down the line?
Yeah, I think really step one, I mean, hopefully you hear the planning theme being a recurring thing that I'm talking about. And I think that's really the most important thing is getting yourself to a point where you're ready to have a conversation. It's the old, you don't know what you don't know. I think we've all run into that in the course of owning our businesses and running and managing our companies. I had a business owner say to me a year or so ago, hey, where did you learn how to do this? Like this is so many different things bundled into one. Like there's not a college course or a program, to go through this. Like how do you figure this out? Because it was so smooth how we did this, and it was neat to watch the different moves that we made along the way and why we did them and everything like that. And I looked at the gentleman and I said, well, um, I said, it's no different than your company, right? You got to where you got to, the processes that you have, the procedures that you have, you did them by making mistakes and by failing, and you refined them and you got better at them every single day for however many years. And now you're really good at it, right? So think about this as a parking lot. And when you came to me, you and I were standing on the one side of the parking lot, and there's all these potholes all over the parking lot. And I put my arm around you and we danced right through the parking lot, all the way to the other side. And I said, you want to know how I knew where all those potholes were in the parking lot? And he was like, yeah. I said, well, I stepped in every single one of them at some point before. So now I know where they're at. And that's really the truth of the matter. So, I mean, anybody that's in any business knows that you have to have experience doing this stuff. The only way to avoid making mistakes is to have experience, and the only way to get experience is to make mistakes. So I think that that's really, to me, the key is reach out to somebody who's done this before. Don't go at it alone. Think ahead. Plan for your exit so you can get the exit that you want. You have that fulfillment that we talked about. And guys like me that do this for a living, that have done it a long time. I mean, listen, just because you pick up the phone or send an email and reach out, like, I'm not trying to get you to sell your company. I mean, you're not going to talk somebody into selling their company. That's not the objective. It's about, let's start, oh, you're thinking about this. Well, tell me a little bit where your head's at. How can we help you? And maybe this is something we do 5 years from now, 6 years from now. It's not a commodity that you're selling here. It's something that you kind of walk into. And so really the key is just picking up the phone and having a conversation and getting started and letting somebody know you're thinking about this. But as every business owner will tell you, I mean, this is super confidential. Nobody wants anybody to know that they're thinking like this and they're having a conversation. They don't want to scare their vendors. They don't want to scare the customers. They don't want to scare the employees. Listen, that's what we do every day. We don't, everything we do is highly confidential, and we're very, very used to that. So I think you can set that fear aside. We sign non-disclosure agreements for folks and everything like that to help calm some of those fears. But if this is something that you're thinking about, the best thing you can do is really get started and stop kicking the can down the road.
So I mentioned at the top you will be in Chicago with us at GFAB. You'll be speaking on Monday, June 15th. What is your message to fabricators, glass fabricators out there about GFAB, and if they're on the fence about whether they can make that trip right at the beginning of June?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be there. So, you should be there too, really. It should really be a great event. We're looking forward to it a lot. And I think anybody that's ever been to an industry conference, can pretty much tell you that when minds come together, you never know what's going to happen, where it's going to go, what you're going to come out of there with, and what nuggets you'll be able to take home with you afterwards. So there's always good stuff at these conferences and these events. Yeah, but you have to be there to get them.
Well, Scott Mashuda, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to seeing you in Chicago. And for now, this has been Glasscast from the National Glass Association and Glass Magazine. We will see you next time.